Despite the years that had passed since they had last seen one another, Kakashi didn't appear to have changed much. He still wore his Hitai-8 over his Sharingan eye, and a mask covered the lower half of his face. There may have been one or two more wrinkles around his lone visible eye, but his hair had always been silver, and while 3 years had felt like a long time to Naruto, in the grand scheme of things, it probably wasn't very long at all. "You look the same, sensei." While still facing the counter, Kakashi's eyes veered to the side towards him. "I'd say the same about you, Naruto, but I'd be lying. You've grown." "I finally hit my growth spurt," he replied drily. "It's not surprising, given who your parents were. Who knows? At this rate, I'll catch up to you, sensei." Tucci slammed 2 steaming bowls of ramen before them. "Eat up." Taking out a pair of chopsticks from a wooden box, Kakashi said, "Poor is the pupil who does not surpass his teacher. Or so they say." The miso broth and the ramen noodles were thick and hot, and the pork belly slices melted into Naruto's mouth. They downed their broths at the same time, lowering the bowls down on the counter. The other customers in the stall had started to talk again, and the ambient noise of their chatter circled around them. It was Kakashi who restarted the conversation. "I'm heading Team Shirakumo now. Naruto had suspected as much. Are they giving you as much trouble as we used to do?" Through the mask, the corners of Kakashi's mouth lifted back. "If only. With the way Sakura and Menma are constantly at each other's throats, I'm just amazed they made it in one piece through their Chunin exams. I suppose Sasuke probably had something to do with it. Then I take it they won't be participating in the Chunin exams going on right now? They've been Chunin as of 2 years ago. While the other Jonin teachers have been exercising a bit more caution with preparing their students, when it came to this team, I couldn't have stopped them even if I'd wanted to." His old teacher's voice was exasperated, but Naruto could detect a note of pride in it. The news of the other Jonin teachers holding back their genin was hardly surprising for Naruto. In wartime, when personnel was running scarce on the battlefields, any schmuck who could throw a shuriken was promoted to Chunin and sent out to fight. But in peacetime as they were now, when their ranks were already thinned out, it must have been quite the unexpected blow to lose 2 promising young Chunin and a veteran Jonin on what had started out as a standard B-rank mission. What was more disconcerting for Naruto, however, was the careful way Kakashi was treading regarding the topic of his new team. He thought it was a given that a ninja of his talents would be charged with the instruction of another promising team. Still, considering the atmosphere of their last exchange before Naruto left the village, Kakashi's trepidation was understandable. "Is that you, Naruto? You're back." Naruto took a second to identify the blonde male in leaf Chunin fatigues beaming down at him as a member of Team Shirakumo. Or rather, Team Kakashi now, he supposed. Drawing up before them, the male, Menma, as he recalled it, took in Naruto's appearance with a wide-eyed look of disbelief. "Wow, it's really you. How was your training?" Menma leaned in towards Naruto, dropping his voice conspiratorially. "I heard you were with one of the Sannin." It seemed Menma had yet to learn a thing or two about personal space. Naruto felt himself sweat. "Congratulations on your promotion." Surprisingly, Menma waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, that was a while ago. What's more impressive is that you got direct training from one of the Sannin. I mean, Kakashi-sensei, no hard feelings, but, a Sannin." "None taken," said Kakashi cheerfully. "Menma, aren't you supposed to be helping to proctor the Chunin exam?" "Ugh, right. I was looking for Sasuke, but then I heard that Naruto was here." With a grimacing salute, Menma disappeared under the stall flap. Left in the wake of what felt like a passing storm, Naruto looked down into his bowl, his reflection swimming in the remaining flecks of oil. While he didn't know exactly what he'd been expecting, it looked as though everyone was doing well. In his absence, the world had continued to move. The flap to the ramen stall lifted up once more and someone walked in with an exclamation of hunger. The dinner rush was about to begin. Standing up to make room, Naruto and Kakashi paused and regarded each other. Though he'd barely reached Kakashi's shoulders before, they were almost the same height now, and the idea of him outstripping the Jonin no longer seemed so far-fetched. The same thought must have occurred to Kakashi. "It's been a while since we last faced off. We'll have to have a rematch sometime soon." Naruto nodded, his thoughts already racing with possible strategies. "I'd like that." The Forest of Death was a common training ground for Chunin, and Naruto himself had favored it in his earlier years. It had been some time since he had last stepped foot in Area 44 however, and most of it was unfamiliar to him. The forest had evolved in his absence. Still, one thing had remained the same, and that was the unsettling feeling of being trapped in a maze. All in all, it made the perfect stage for the Chunin exams. The second test was now fully underway, with multiple candidate teams already clashing with one another. Perhaps fueled by adrenaline, the majority of the teams seemed intent on the offensive instead of preparing sustenance and shelter for the inevitable days ahead. In true genin fashion, the majority of the skirmishes weren't lethal, and given the massive scale of the forest, Naruto would have been hard-pressed to find anything worthy of report. I've already put operatives in place to report back on any suspicious activity. It would give me some peace of mind if you would lend me your strength and join them. In the eerie stillness of Naruto's surroundings, far from the hubbub of the village, it was easier to attempt to discern the Hokage's true intentions. The most superficial interpretation was that the Hokage wanted to gauge Naruto's abilities, and also bring him back into the third service. While it was already an underhanded way of killing two birds with one stone, Naruto couldn't help but feel as though there was something else lurking beneath the surface. Something bigger than his return was happening in the village right now, and he would bet his Tonto it had something to do with the presence of the hidden rock in the exams. There. Naruto came to an immediate stop. Through a patch of vines, he could make out two teams facing each other down. Judging from their apparel and Hitai 8, it would be a showdown between Leaf and Rock, an inevitable confrontation, given their shared history of conflict in the World Wars. Of further note, he thought he could vaguely recall the Leaf team, two females and an overweight male, from his initial class at the academy. Just hand over your scroll, and maybe we'll let you walk away from this, said the Rock team's leader. One of the Leaf genin scoffed, flipping her long blonde hair. Someone's going to be handing over their scroll, alright, and it's not us. Out of principle, Naruto fought against the urge to roll his eyes. While trash talk was a basic strategy to stave off one's opponent while sizing them up, he had a feeling it would be empty words rather than fists that determined the outcome of this specific encounter. You Leaf ninja think you're so smart inviting us here, but we know what you're really trying to do, said the Rock genin. And we're here to make sure it doesn't happen. This caught the attention of the lone male Leaf genin, who for some reason, was munching on a bag of chips. What do you mean? Drop it. They're just genin, what would they know, hissed another Rock genin. Look, I don't know what crazy stuff your Kage is telling you guys, but honestly, that's got nothing to do with us, said the blonde. We're here to pass the exam. All three members of the Rock team stiffened. You dare insult the Lord Third? You'll pay for that. Finally abandoning words for fists, the screeching sound of metal meeting metal resounded through the air. The two teams seemed evenly matched, and it could go either way. Naruto wasn't interested in sticking around for a genin fight, especially when it seemed the teams were done talking. At the very least, he wouldn't be leaving empty-handed, thanks to the Rock genin's slip of tongue. In a small clearing deep in the woods, dark blood rained down from the sand-encased body. Temari could hear it splattering heavily on the top of her umbrella. As was usually the case around Gaara, the teammates of the genin who had just been crushed to death began to beg for their lives. We'll give the scroll to you. Please, just let us go. And as usual, their voices fell upon deaf ears. Dropping his umbrella, Gaara raised his two hands and squeezed. His sand rose to his bidding, and 2 splatters later, the entire team was dead. Distastefully taking in the bloody sight, Temari let out a sigh. From the corner of her eye, she saw their new teammate, a younger genin named Matsuri who'd been hastily recruited as replacement, wave her hand cheekily. Bye, bye. Temari's lips twisted into a half-smile. Once upon a time, she had found such scenes similarly amusing, but nowadays, they merely brought her a sense of increasing apprehension for Gaara. He'd never been normal, but family was family, and when it came down to it, he was her brother. It was one of the reasons why she'd agreed to remain a genin over the past few years, instead of being promoted to chunin, as was expected of a kunoichi of her age and prowess in the village, to keep watch over the Sand's greatest weapon. While he didn't listen to anyone, at the very least, he acknowledged Temari's existence, and in theory, she could keep him in check. It was a haphazard system that had somehow gotten them through the past few years. These days, however, something was changing in him. Whatever was left of Gaara was slipping away. She could feel it more and more acutely. She could feel the something else in his body glowering out at the world through dark-rimmed eyes, biding its time. As Gaara's blood-soaked sand returned to his gourd, Matsuri walked over to the chunks of flesh that now littered the ground. Her nose wrinkling in disgust, she bent over and picked up a damp scroll. It's a heaven scroll, she announced. While Gaara didn't respond, Temari felt his eyes turn towards her, and she suppressed a shudder. Good, she said instead. Let's head towards the tower. Although the trees were too dense to see much past the canopy from the forest floor, judging from the ever-growing darkness, the sun had just about set on the day. They're late. Did they get killed off already? Burami grouched, hungrily tearing the cap off a large mushroom. Kazami paced, as he had done for the past hour. It's hard to believe Shiror and his team, of all people, would have been taken out so quickly. It's not like them to run late, but if Karen can't see them. Despite having already searched the forest several times within the last hour, Karen had been unable to locate the chakra signatures of their fellow Kusa genin. With her current capabilities, the range of her mind's eye was wide enough to cover the radius of a large swathe of the forest. It was a grim indicator of their fates. Well, she could have messed up, so have her check again, said Burami impatiently. Opening her mouth in protest, Karen had to stop herself. While she'd yet to meet anyone who could hide their chakra from her, her teammates didn't have as much faith in her abilities. And in her opinion, it was always better to be underestimated. Compliantly closing her eyes, she concentrated her mind's eye, and froze. There was a new chakra signature within her range, rapidly approaching them, and it was so foul, she felt bile creeping up her throat. It reminded her of the pungent smell following a battle, when the reek of rotting flesh from both the injured and dead started to permeate the cloth of the medical tents. It was moving at almost unbelievable speeds, and it seemed as though it would pass them by, when, to her horror, as though sensing her gaze, it suddenly seemed to slow down by them. If there was one thing Karen's years in the hands of Zosui had done for her, it was honing her survival instincts. Said instincts were screaming at her now, and immediately opening her eyes, Karen stood stock still as sweat poured down from her temples. While it was not the biggest or most powerful chakra signature she had ever seen before, she had never before felt so much like prey, trapped in the impending fangs of a predator. Even if she were to run now, she knew it was far too late. "What's wrong with you?" As though sounding from a distance, Karen heard Burami ask. It was astonishing to her, how unaware her teammates were of their imminent demise. They were almost within the striking distance of an absolute monster, and yet Kazami continued to pace and Burami, to eat. Several minutes went by, each second passing like daggers stabbing into her chest. But nobody approached them, and when Karen finally reined in the courage to check again, the chakra signature had somehow disappeared. She was just about to open her eyes, when suddenly, she felt what she had been searching for from the moment they entered the village, an immense chakra, both sharp and rough, both cold and yet strangely nostalgic, a chakra full of contradictions. They said that 3 heads were better than 1, and in Naruto's case, 20. While the Hokage had said there were other operatives in the forest running surveillance, they would not be reporting back to Naruto, nor did he have any faith that the Lord Third would be in the mood to divulge any information. Once his shadow clones had been sent out to disperse themselves throughout the forest, Naruto decided it was late enough in the day to pursue his next priority of interest. Naruto bit into his thumb for the blood offering. Kuchios no Jutsu, summoning technique. Clouds of smoke fanned out from a red fox that landed nimbly beside him. About time. I was starting to think you'd finally given up. You won't get rid of me that easily. We'll see about that, said Amakuro, flicking his tail. Naruto eyed the fox critically. It had definitely gotten bigger since he'd last summoned it just a few days ago. Whereas the fox had barely reached his knee the first time they'd met, its head now reached Naruto's shoulder, and that was with his own growth spurt over the past 2 years. It was a possible indicator that, no matter how much Amakuro griped about helping Naruto, it was reaping some tangible benefit of its own out of their contract. Either that, or Amakuro was as much a shooting beanstalk, as it often delighted in describing him, as Naruto. The forest of death was almost entirely covered in a canopy of dense foliage, but it thinned out towards the center, allowing moonlight to peek through to the forest floor in patches. Taking in a deep breath, Naruto settled down in one such patch. Bringing his hands together on his lap, he closed his eyes and stilled his heart. By signing the summoning contract with Amakuro, Naruto had expected to eventually be granted access to the Fox's Sage region. When Jiraiya had first introduced the notion of Sage Mode to Naruto, he had told him of the wonders of Mount Myaboku, an entire hidden land that served as home for the toads and training grounds for hopeful practitioners to hone their senses. When he'd first ventured the topic with Amakuro, however, the fox simply looked amused. Why settle down when foxes can live anywhere the moon reaches? The key to reaching Sage Mode was concentration and balance. The first part was not an issue for Naruto, who had long since mastered the art of meditation. The issue was with the latter. Balancing natural energy with his own physical and spiritual energy wasn't as simple as it sounded, especially when his energy happened to harbor a tailed beast. Whenever he thought he had achieved balance, something in the beast's chakra rejected it, creating a disturbance that destroyed it. Something about it brought back some dusty memories for Naruto. Back when he had been in the academy, he could remember trying to study the seal on his abdomen and the nine tails chakra that always seemed to disrupt his ninjutsu. Ultimately, his efforts hadn't led anywhere thanks to the interference from the taboo seal, and he had simply chosen to ignore the alien chakra. Given this frustrating impasse with the beast's chakra, Naruto was beginning to wonder if there was something he could do to block it from his own. However, while Jiraiya had taught Naruto the fundamental basics of Fuinjutsu over the years, it wasn't something that could be properly explored for a pair that had constantly been on the move. Dismissing these thoughts, Naruto was just starting to channel his focus when Amakuro spoke. "I sense a giant mass of chakra in the forest, another tailed beast." Its voice was low and urgent, with none of its usual snide. In an instant, the implications of such a statement became clear. A freed, rampaging tailed beast would undoubtedly have made itself known by now, which could only mean that there was another Jinchuriki in the forest besides Naruto. The question then became, were they one of the genin candidates, one of the foreign delegates, or something else? Before Karen could convince herself that it was a bad idea, her mouth opened on its own. "I've found him." Her teammates shot to their feet. "Lead the way," said Kazami, his voice tinged in obvious relief. Swallowing, she nodded. Though Karen would pay for it dearly when they found out she'd been lying, she couldn't let this chance slip through her fingers. For all she knew, Naruto was simply taking a shortcut through the forest on his way out of the village. She wanted to meet him, properly this time. She wanted to thank him for the fish, and ask if he remembered their fight in the Hidden Sands Chunin exams, and, well, she didn't know what else she could say to him, but in her surging excitement, she brushed that negligible thought aside. She could tell Naruto had several clones spreading out through the forest, but the real Naruto wasn't too far from their team's position. As she focused, she could sense a secondary chakra presence with him. Though it wasn't human, she could sense a connection between the two, a summons, perhaps? The trees were starting to thin out, they were drawing close. Karen could feel her heart pounding in her ears, and she sped up, leaving behind her teammates. Soon, they would meet. As though Naruto didn't already have enough on his mind, Amakuro's ears fell back flat against its head. "There's a sensor type nearby, and they're coming straight for us," it warned. "They shouldn't be an issue for you, but there's something about one of them." By then, Naruto could pick it up as well. A team of 3 was rapidly approaching, making little effort to hide their presence, which meant they either thought he was weak, unlikely, considering the pinpoint accuracy with which the sensor type had detected him, or that he was their ally. Neither was true. However, while he could have used some light exercise, he wasn't a participant in the exams, and he had a feeling the Hokage wouldn't be appreciative of such direct interference. It was time to leave. A wave of blue lightning crackled from his feet up to his head before dissipating into the air. The low, almost indiscernible hum of electricity filled the air, and as Naruto felt his hair stand on end, he knew that if he so chose, he could have been to the other side of the forest before his pursuers could even stop to blink. But something about the way Amakuro had described it had piqued his interest, and Naruto slowed down just long enough to get a glimpse of his would-be pursuer, a red-headed Kusa genin about his age, eyes starting to widen in belated shock as he passed her. As he shot out of range, he thought she looked vaguely familiar. As the various genin teams were herded to their assigned gates, Team Agisai found themselves starting the second exam at Gate 3, putting them deep in the northeastern sector of the exam site. According to their team's sensor, Suiren, that also put them well within striking range of the monster from sand. "You're sure that's the Jinchuriki Tenshi-sama was talking about?" Agisai asked for the 5th time that day. "Who else could the lady have been speaking of?" said Suiren. "It was so monstrous, the moment I felt it, I almost threw up." Haku resisted the urge to scowl, forcibly maintaining his usual serene smile. Almost was an understatement. The oily stain on his sash from when she dribbled on him could attest to that. Suiren cast him an anxious look. Given his level of chakra, I don't know if even Haku could win in a one-on-one against him. Haku wasn't a censor, but he thought he could have figured that much out for himself. He had gotten a passing look at the Suna genin in question during the first exam, and his immediate impression was that with his bloodshot eyes and uncontrolled bloodthirst, the shinobi looked downright unhinged. While Haku was confident in his ability to hold his own in a confrontation, he was not quite willing to stake his life on it. "It's a good thing, then, that Tenshi-sama's orders were merely to bring back information," he replied neutrally. Agisai's face cleared, as it tended to do whenever the lady's name was mentioned. "That's right. For now, our focus is on passing the second round." According to the second exam proctor, this would not just be a test of their offensive abilities, but also of their survival and endurance skills. The exam had a time limit of 5 days, and required at least 2 members of your team to reach the tower in the center of the forest while in possession of both the Heaven and Earth scrolls. It was a simple exam, where the weak would be weeded out and the strong would prevail. While Haku's teammates were not exactly prodigies, they were more than capable of carrying their own weight, and he had little doubt they would pass. Unfortunately, it seemed that the exam had other plans for Team Agisai. Just as they had divided up their roles, Suiren suddenly stiffened, her face turning ashen. "There's something coming. Run!" She broke off as with a flash, a thin line of red appeared on her neck, and then her head twisting at an unnatural angle, she crumpled to the ground. Haku had already started to move the moment he saw the look of horror on Suiren's face. Just as he dodged backwards, he managed to catch sight of a long and narrow blade slashing right through where his head had been. "Suiren," he heard Agisai cry out in anguish. Good, she had survived, too. No longer caught under the element of surprise, it was a simple matter for Haku to detect the shrill sound of metal flying through air. Easily deflecting the kunai with his senbon, he backed up against Agisai, who had drawn out her armamentarium of sealing tags. "Not bad," an unfamiliar voice breathed. It belonged to a genin that had suddenly appeared, dangling upside down on a nearby tree branch. His long black hair hung to the ground, revealing his kusa hitayate. "Now. Why don't you show me what else you've got?" Haku raised his left hand in a seal. "Gladly." The air rapidly dropped in temperature and the forest around them filled with thick white mist. Though he didn't wear the Hunter-nin mask anymore, Haku could feel his emotions receding, and his face glazed over. It felt more natural that way, than the smiles he always wore in public. It told him that he hadn't forgotten his roots. Hayaton, Hyoso, ice release, ice spears. In an instant, ice crackled out of midair into deadly spears that exploded into the tree the genin hung from. With inhuman speed, the genin leaped away, letting loose a ghostly laugh of delight. Not to be forgotten, Agisai jumped in, sending a barrage of summoned shuriken after the genin. However, the genin was proving himself slippier than he'd appeared, as with apparent ease, he weaved between their combined attacks. Eyes narrowing, Haku sped up and matched the shinobi's movements. In a match of speed, he would not lose. Mother was screaming again. Gripping his head, feeling as though it would split in his agony, Gaara staggered. His sister shouted his name, but he shoved her aside. "Rip her head off, crush her into pieces, give me blood, feed her to me, slice her up, rip out her heart, give me blood, give me blood." The screaming always began at night. It was strongest when the moon took up the entire sky. Gaara knew that a single moment's lapse of consciousness would lead to Mother taking over his body, and he couldn't let that happen. He wasn't sure why, but he knew he had to stay alert. When its blood began to boil, and he felt his eyes starting to roll back, Gaara knew he had to do something to appease it. If he didn't, he would implode. Rip her body apart, crush her innards, blood, give me blood. It must have been the fault of the full moon, but Mother had not been satiated by the 3 Gaara had killed earlier that day. He inhaled, looking out at the world through a red haze. His sister, currently shouting something indiscernible at him, was the closest to Gaara, but he moved on. As annoying as she was, he couldn't kill her. That left their other teammate, the girl, whose name he still didn't know. There was no point, when he always ended up killing them. "Give me blood, I can't take it, crush, slaughter, kill." "Don't worry, Mother," he snarled, his voice twisting gutturally in his throat. "I'll get you what you want soon enough." At his bidding, his sand rose out of his gourd. The spy he had planted in Amigakure had not been lying in his reports when it came to the mysterious boy. It was with increasing delight that Orochimaru watched the battle unfold before his eyes. The boy's every movement, in its speed and gracefulness, was a work of art. The way he effortlessly obliterated their surroundings with cold, single-minded efficiency sent a shiver tingling down his spine. Given the way he wielded ice as though it was an extension of his body, it must have been a powerful Kekkei Genkai. Best of all, however, was his face. A host candidate could have had the rarest Kekkei Genkai in the entire world. If the face was not to Orochimaru's liking, he wouldn't have given it a second glance. Cutting short his internal monologue, Orochimaru leaped away from a barrage of water needles, each one as deadly as a blade. Despite his efforts, one cut through his cheek, shredding the skin of his borrowed face. He could feel the cold air brush against his actual host body's flesh, and he let out a hiss, half pain, half pleasure. This boy made coming back to this pathetic village all the more worthwhile, even if Uchiha boy was off limits. Making up his mind, Orochimaru decided it was time to stop playing with his food. Dropping low to the ground, his neck elongated, and his head shot forward through the air. Before the boy could react, he bit his neck, leaving behind a small piece of himself, his cursed seal. Drawing back, he tasted the blood in his mouth, and felt satisfaction spread like wildfire through his body. Oh, this boy would serve very well as his next host. Come find me when your own strength can take you no further, he hissed. As the boy fell to his knees, screaming, Orochimaru disappeared. Given the lethal nature of the second exam and the stage that it took place in, Sakura had been more than prepared to see the dead bodies that would inevitably crop up. As Izumo and Kotetsu made the report, however, the sight before her eyes made even her legendarily tough stomach turn. Judging from their belongings and the papers we found, they were all shinobi from the hidden grass, and were registered to take part in the Chunin exams. And as you can see, their features are completely gone, the faces as smooth as if they'd been melted away. Show me the photos from the dead shinobi's ID. At once. Sakura scanned the photos, her brow furrowed in thought. She could only vaguely recall the faces from the crowd of genin that had lined up for their consent forms and scrolls. It was difficult to say whether this team had been killed before or after the exam had started, and what kind of ninjutsu could do this to the bodies. Izumo and Kotetsu, please report what's happened to the Lord Third, she instructed, before turning to her teammate, who was eyeing the bodies in an appalled but curious sort of way. Menma, review whatever security footage we have within the vicinity for me. I want to know what exactly happened here. With her orders, the three Chunin disappeared, leaving Sakura alone to grimly regard the forest. Something about the faceless bodies at her feet had her wondering what other horrors could possibly be occurring in there, and the words she'd uttered sarcastically to herself earlier came to mind. And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee. Their eyes had met, Karen was sure of it. Naruto had seen her, and recognized her. That had to have been what had happened, because otherwise, she would have been nearly completely drained of her chakra and thrown against the side of their makeshift shelter for no good reason. As predicted, Burami and Kazami hadn't taken it well when she suddenly stopped and told them she had lost track of the chakra. They hadn't been able to catch sight of the ninja that blitzed past them, and were still under the impression it was Shior's ghost that they'd been chasing. Karen wasn't stupid. She didn't tell them that Shior was long dead. Instead, she let them bite her arms and guzzle down her chakra, before snoring away on a full stomach while she kept watch. It was a full moon, her whole body ached. And yet, somehow, the light seemed to ease the aching in her chest just a little bit. As the first day of the exams drew to a close, an ANBU Black Op approached Naruto and traded off with him for the night. The Lord Third apologizes for putting you to work so soon after your return, and bids that you get some rest before resuming duties in the morning. Both he and Naruto knew that he would be leaving his clones overnight, but he obligingly inclined his head before leaving the forest. It had been quite some time since he'd returned home. Stepping inside his apartment, Naruto turned on the light. Flickering once, and then twice, it turned on, illuminating the area in a stark, fluorescent light. The first thing Naruto noticed was that someone must have recently cleaned it, for instead of the thick layers of dust he'd been expecting, it was spotless and smelled vaguely of detergent. For a split second, he wondered whether Kakashi could have had the foresight to clean it beforehand for him, but the very thought of the Jonin even picking up a mop was so ridiculous, Naruto dismissed it outright. More likely, the Hokage had gotten it cleaned in order to curry some favor or to invoke whatever feelings of nostalgia Naruto may have had for the village. Unfortunately, if such shrewd calculations had indeed been at play, they may not have been entirely off the mark. In the 3 years since he had last been there, the space seemed smaller than he remembered. He knew, however, that the only thing that had changed was himself. His apartment had always been plainly furnished, with little to no personal effects. The few items he'd once valued, his tanto, his hitai-8, he'd always kept on himself. And yet, here and there, from the markings of use and wear, he could see bits of his past flash through his mind. There, that armchair, that was where Kakashi had once preferred to sit in their discussions of chakra application, and there was a resultant dent in the cushion from the constant use. There, that crack in the wall by the entryway, that was from all the times Rai had slammed the door open when Naruto didn't answer on the first knock. And there, in the kitchen, it was hidden away, but Naruto knew that if he opened the first drawer to the right of the sink, he would find the waxy stubs of 11 candles. In a way, it felt as though his apartment had been frozen in time, waiting for him to return. But now that he finally had, he almost felt like an intruder, as though he was not quite the Naruto the space had been waiting for. Silently, Naruto looked outside his window. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a lone dog whined. All of a sudden, a sharp knock rapped at his front door, and at the same time, memories of one of his shadow clones began to flash through his mind. He made for the door, simultaneously reviewing the information the clone had obtained. To his disappointment, there wasn't much he didn't already know, as all it confirmed was that the hidden rock was participating in the exams for less than amicable reasons. Though it was nothing the Hokage wouldn't already be fully aware of, he made a mental note to send along a messenger clone later on. The door swung open to reveal yet another familiar face. "Sasuke," said Naruto, not entirely surprised, but still taken aback. "What brings you here?" Though they had once helped the other put away his futon in Wave Country, Naruto could not for the life of him remember ever having a proper conversation with Sasuke. All he really knew about Sasuke was that he was the lone survivor of the infamous Uchiha clan, and that Kakashi seemed to hold him in high regard. For his part, Sasuke seemed rather confused himself as to what he was doing there outside of Naruto's apartment. "I had some questions regarding your journey. About what you found, out there." Naruto paused, and then stepped back. "Come on in." He could have turned him away, and the faint look of surprise on Sasuke's face as he crossed over the threshold suggested that had been his expected outcome. While that may have been the case 3 years ago, after everything that had happened, the sanctity of his private quarters no longer seemed quite so important to Naruto. He couldn't even feel the entire right side of his body anymore, but Kakashi was still pushing at the boulder in a futile attempt to roll it away. "Don't, it's okay, Kakashi. I don't think I can make it," he mumbled, before coughing out blood. "Obito," he heard Rin cry out. Something about that seemed to break Kakashi, who stopped, and fell to his knees. "Damn it. If only I'd listened to you from the start and we'd come to save Rin, this never would have happened." His voice broke into a raw cry. "So what if I'm a captain? So what if I made Jonin?" Kakashi's words cut through the dense fog that had become Obito's mind, and with his last fleetingly cohesive thoughts, he made his decision. "Oh yeah. I had forgotten. I was the only one who didn't give you a gift for becoming a Jonin, Kakashi. I was wondering what to give you, and I just had a thought." It was getting harder and harder for Obito to talk, but somehow, he pushed through. "I'm giving you my Sharingan. Whatever the village may say, Kakashi, you are a great Jonin." His lone eye visible through the mask flew open. Breathing hard, Toby sat up. It was dark in the hideout, and as his breathing evened, he could make out the dark outlines of the various sound operatives scattered throughout the cave. Near the entrance, the pair on guard duty glanced at him before returning to their game of cards. Putting some distance between himself and the hideout, Toby eventually found himself at the edge of a cliff. He exhaled, and looked up at the sky. It had been a long time since he had last seen that dream. The night was still, and the moon was full. Ignoring the inevitable staring that followed as soon as he had entered the stadium, Naruto seated himself in the stands. He was technically there to gather information on the foreign participants, though he suspected the Hokage had just wanted to keep an eye on him. However, he couldn't complain. The mission fell along the lines of his own interests, what with Amakuro detecting a Jinchuriki in the forest. It seemed this year's crop for the Chunin exams had more than its usual share of talent. The number of genin passing the second exam's criteria had exceeded expectations, and the proctors had set up a preliminary stage to trim the proverbial fat. The same thing had happened when Naruto had taken the exam. Had it really been only 4 years ago? So many things had happened since then, it almost felt like the events of a past life. Back then, he had still been under the influence of the taboo seal, and his biggest preoccupation had been on improving his standing in the eyes of the village. But now, he was here, on the other side. He sat in the stands as a part of the faceless audience that had once jeered down at him. Their spectacle was the group of genin that stood at attention at the center of the arena. Several faces immediately jumped out at Naruto, first and foremost, a male Suna genin. He was pale, with auburn hair and black-rimmed eyes. It was a distinctive appearance that Naruto immediately recalled having glowered at him during his short time in Sunagakure. Even without seeing him fight, Naruto could tell that he was strong. Given the amount of attention he was getting from the rest of the spectators, it was clear he was a popular contender. The next face he focused on was a Kunoichi from the hidden grass. She was the same censor that had pursued him in Area 44 during the second exam, and now that he looked closer, the persistent sense that she looked familiar grew even stronger. His eyes locked on her bright red hair. It wasn't every day that he saw a shade so similar to his own. Unlike the third exam, the victors of the preliminary matches will be determined on a first blood-drawn basis, said the third proctor, a Chunin with a spiky ponytail. The first match will be between Temari from the Hidden Sand and Akimichi Choji from the Hidden Leaf. A blonde kunoichi, yet again, another familiar face from the time when Naruto had taken the exam, and the chubby genin he'd seen in the forest stepped up to the platform stage. While he hadn't stayed long enough to see the outcome of their fight against the IWA team, he supposed they must have emerged the victor. In terms of aptitude, it was an oddly balanced match, while Temari was clearly the more experienced ninja whose skills would easily have matched those of most chunin. Her primarily long-range wind release techniques were weathered without too much difficulty by her bulkier opponent. Choji, on the other hand, seemed to rely on a clumsy but powerful technique that combined his sheer mass with his chakra, turning into a ball that left a destructive crater wherever he landed. If he had actually had the speed to keep up, he would have demolished Temari in a single hit. The specific conditions of the match, however, gave one of the pair a clear advantage, a fact that she clearly realized. Abandoning her fan, which seemed to multiply the power of her techniques, but slowed them down in the process, Temari began to circle Choji, swinging her palm towards him at every opportunity, while always staying just out of his range. Each swing generated a blade of wind that propelled itself towards Choji's body, and it was a testimony to the level of her mastery over wind release that each struck with deadly precision. As Choji switched to a more defensive position, Temari picked up her offensive, and soon, it was almost as though she was dancing around him, each swing of her hands adding to an inescapable net that closed in around the leaf genin. It was a slow but calculated execution, and eventually, one blade of wind slipped through Choji's defense, slicing through his sleeve. A thin, inarguable line of red glistened on his forearm. It was the barest of cuts, and would have hardly hindered the genin. However, rules were rules, and the first blood had been drawn. "Stop!" shouted the proctor. "The winner is Temari from the Hidden Sand." His declaration was met with a polite smattering of applause from the audience. The jonin in front of Naruto yawned. It hadn't been the most exciting match, and had ended on a technicality. Judging from the neutral expression on Temari's face, she knew it too, and she descended from the stage without celebrating her victory. However, something about her had caught Naruto's attention, and he found himself admiring her composed attitude. She knew her strengths and her limitations, and used her given constraints to her advantage. She would make a great chunin. Her face wasn't bad to look at either. From his travels with Jiraiya, Naruto had seen more than his fair share of beautiful women, but with her sharp, even features, he thought Temari left quite a lasting impression on her own terms. "Something catch your eye, Naruto?" asked Kakashi, who joined him at some point in the battle. Naruto immediately removed his scrutiny. While it was an innocent enough question, given the shrewd side-eye the jonin was directing at him, he thought the safer bet would be to deflect the question. "Looks like it'll be a strong group of contenders this year, especially from the other villages. There's not much I can say about Konoha's showing, however. Well, there's been some buzz over the Hokage's grandson, though that may be more due to his lineage than his prowess. And, I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss the others." Having said that, Kakashi offered him a mysterious smile. Following Naruto's return to the village, he had wondered how to resume his relationship with his former teacher. It seemed he needn't have worried, however, as Kakashi was clearly making a conscientious effort to maintain the amicable atmosphere of their meeting at Ichiraku. The next match will be between Ajisai of the Hidden Rain and Yamanaka Ino from the Hidden Leaf. Begi. Even before the proctor's hand had fully extended into the air, the blonde leaf genin made her move. Making a square with her hands, she directed them at her opponent, a stone-faced female. Ninpo, Shinranshin no Jutsu, mind destruction technique. While Naruto had certainly heard of the Yamanaka clan, the only Yamanaka he knew in person was Menma, and he had never gotten the chance to take a close look at their famous clan techniques. The result was in equal parts instantaneous and impressive. A look of perplexity crossing the aim genin's face, she raised her own kunai to her arm, and nicked it, drawing blood. Naruto felt his brows rising. Kakashi's smile widened through the mask. Much like the preceding match, it had been a victory determined by quick-thinking strategy rather than a show of power. However, perhaps because of the victor's local origins, at the proctor's declaration of her win, the stands broke out into noticeably more enthusiastic applause. The preliminaries continued. Some matches were determined in an instant while others were more equally matched and drawn out. Throughout, Naruto couldn't knock the sense that he was being closely watched by someone, and he quickly identified the source as the red-haired Kusa genin. The moment they made eye contact, the girl's face broke into a big smile that made Naruto blink. Unfortunately, he wasn't the only one to have noticed the unsolicited attention. "You know her, Naruto?" It seemed nothing ever escaped Kakashi when he put his mind to it. "I faced off against her during my chunin exams in Sunagakure," said Naruto evasively. The memory had come to him shortly after first catching sight of her, though from what he recalled, nothing had passed between them that would have warranted such a warm greeting. And that's it? That's it. Kakashi didn't sound convinced, though he dropped the topic. The next match will be between Sarutobi Konohamaru from the Hidden Leaf, and Haku from the Hidden Rain, called out the proctor. A young male leaf genin and a fair-skinned AIM genin of ambiguous gender headed up to the stage. The jonin who'd been dozing off in front of Naruto perked up, no doubt, an effect of the Sarutobi name. Begin. Crouching close to the ground, the leaf genin, Konohamaru, brandished a staff that became swathed in bright flames. With a defiant shout, the boy shot forward and leaped into the air, gaining momentum before bearing down on his opponent. In an effortless dodge, the AIM genin slipped past Konohamaru and returned with a barrage of senbon directed straight at the leaf genin's exposed back. Not so easily outdone, Konohamaru twisted and spun his staff, the needles bursting into flames as they were batted away. For a moment, their respective weapons held out defensively before them, the two regarded each other warily, and then shot towards each other once more. Despite Konohamaru's obvious talent, the AIM genin called Haku wielded an agile speed that would have left the average jonin in his dust, and Naruto was surprised the battle had progressed as far as it already had. This phenomenon only started to make sense when he realized that, for some reason, Haku had yet to use any ninjutsu, and that on top of that, they weren't using their right hand. Naruto swallowed. Alarms were going off in his head as he watched the shinobi weave in and out of Konohamaru's relentless attacks. That speed and senbon-based offensive, combined with their disabled right hand, could it be? Was it the mercenary he'd encountered at Gato's hideout? Naruto had left him alive, after all, so it was well within the realms of possibility. But if that was the case, why wasn't he using his ice release ninjutsu? Eventually, the fight between Konohamaru and Haku drew to a close when Haku's swift movements threw the younger genin off balance. Stumbling, one of the senbon slipped through his defenses and cut his cheek. The winner, Haku from the Hidden Rain. Visibly disappointed, Konohamaru lowered his staff, and the flames faded away. "You did well, honorable grandson," shouted out the jonin in front of Naruto. Raising his head, Konohamaru returned the praise with a glum nod, however, he hadn't been the only one to look in their direction. For a moment, just as he was descending from the stage, Haku's eyes flickered up to their seats, and froze. It passed in a flash, and then Haku looked away. To any other bystander, it wouldn't have raised any flags. But for Naruto, it was the final nail in the coffin. Haku knew who he was, and that could only mean he was the hunter Nin from Wave Country. What was he doing all the way here, masquerading as an AIM genin? Was it for revenge? But there was something odd about the way Haku had been looking at them. Given that the moment had passed, it was difficult to say for sure. Rather than at Naruto, it had felt as though the shinobi had been looking at the seat beside him. Casually, Naruto glanced at Kakashi. There was no reaction there, making it a difficult situation to decipher. Before he could ponder on it further, however, the coming match would quickly overshadow its significance. The next match will be between Gaara from the Hidden Sand and Furuyo from the Hidden Rock. The proctor needn't have announced the next match. The moment the Suna genin stepped onto the stage and saw his opponent, the sheer wave of malevolent bloodlust he exuded swept over the stadium, stunning the entire audience into silence. Naruto felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. As for the match, it was over in a flash. One moment, the two genin were facing each other on the stage. The next, sand erupted out of the Suna genin's gourd, enveloping the other before he could react. When the sand receded, it revealed a broken corpse lying prostrate on the ground. Dark blood trickled from the agape mouth and swollen eye sockets. The stadium descended into chaos. The proctor must have realized what was happening, for he'd used a technique that extended his shadow to immobilize the Suna genin. But it was far too late. It wasn't difficult to piece together what had happened. The sand had infiltrated his opponent's body through every orifice and crushed his organs in a single blow. It was cold-blooded murder. Ironically, it could also be considered merciful, for the genin's life had been snuffed out so instantaneously, it must have been a painless death. Several medical nin crowded the dead genin's body, as futile an effort as it was, and the third exam's proctor continued to hold Gaara in place. The genin did not fight against it. His icy cold eyes glowering out at the audience, he stood stock still. His tremendous bloodlust had abated to a steady stream, as though it was a separate entity that had been momentarily satiated. Naruto felt his heart tremor. He didn't need to summon Amakuro to confirm. He had found him, his counterpart, the other Jinchuriki in the forest. Eventually, after an emergency meeting between the proctors, Gaara's win was declared valid, on the technicality that first blood had been drawn on the moment of his opponent's death. His name was added to the brackets for the official third exam, and the preliminaries continued. However, none of the following matches proved to be of any note for Naruto, with perhaps the lone exception of the fight between the Kusa Kunoichi and her Leaf opponent, a bout from which she emerged the victor. By the end of the preliminaries, the skies were red and orange as yet another day drew to a close. Reflecting on the events of the past day, Naruto decided to take the long route home as an opportunity to stretch his legs. There were multiple things to take into consideration, most notably the hunter Nin he'd fought against in Wave Country, and the Hidden Sands Jinchuriki. There were so many forces in motion, so many unknowns, and he knew it couldn't be coincidence that all of this was happening at the same time. It seemed that Naruto had returned straight into a predator's web. Here and there, with every discovery, he thought he could just barely make out the faint outline of a spinning line. Who, or what, was the mastermind pulling the strings? Deep in thought, before Naruto had properly realized, his lone footsteps had taken him the opposite way from his apartment. While it wasn't too late to turn back, he kept going, and soon, he found himself staring at a series of names inscribed in a stone face. Kamizuki Mayu. Hagain Rai. There was a white carnation at the base of the memorial stone. Taking care not to disturb it, Naruto sat down. He let out a slow exhale, and the numerous thoughts crowding his head faded away. These days, for Naruto, time seemed to fly by in an instant. With his training, there was always something to learn, something to practice. Like clockwork, the sun rose and set without fail, the world moved without rest. But here, just here, for a moment, he felt timeless. I'm home, he said, at last. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.